is a case in point. A book that covers fields from primatology to robotics and from philosophy to arachnology. Several notable philosophers have told Louise that they bought her book for their partners to read so that their partners would be able to understand what these philosophers were up to. Some of her enthusiasm and wit is also apparent in the title of her papers. For instance, Back to the Rough Ground and Into the Hurly-Burly, Why Cognitive Ethology Needs a Wittgenstein's Razor, Taking the Aggravation Out of Data Aggregation, Why Dolphins Are Not Aquatic Apes, Too Much Monkey Business, Evolutionary Perspectives on Human Height Variation. Oh. That one is a bit boring, huh? Staring Down the Cool Kids, Why Behaviorism Isn't Satanism, and also, this time she delivers, Blank Slates, Straw Men, and Sacred Cows. Some possibly heretical views on evolution and human behavior. Louise Barrett.
Okay, I'm going to just do this. Right, so I had to just move my computer then because and I'm in the UK, it's very possible my mum could have Skyped me right in the middle of this, and I didn't really want that to happen, so I had to turn the wireless off. So yes, this is what I want to... first of all, let me say thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me. As Rebecca said, it's a great honour to do so because it was started by people that I knew when I was doing my PhD and that I've taught at UCL and at Liverpool. And so it's a lovely place for me to come back to, and it's a real thrill to be able to speak to you today and give a talk to everybody. And it is indeed the most friendly of conferences, and I really appreciate that. So, and it looks like this will be no exception. So yes, the other thing that's really nice is to be able to give the talk here in the John Snow Lecture Theatre because, as Dame Anne Mills just said, the thing about John Snow is that this was a kind of triumph of public health, and also of the scientific method. So, as you know, he had the pump. So you can see the pump handle right outside the room here. So he had the pump handle from the Broad Street pump removed, because he had come up with this theory that cholera was a waterborne disease, and that in order to prove that point, he asked the handle to be removed from the pump, because he located to that specific pump as a source of the cholera outbreak. And the pump handle was removed, and the cholera outbreak, which was already in the decline, was brought to a much swifter end. And not only that, it prevented another outbreak from beginning just after, because the kind of patient zero was again contaminating the water under Broad Street. So, as well as the removal of the pump handle, John Snow also produced this famous map, and you usually see it you don't usually see it in this version, and this is because this shows you the technique he used, which was Voronoi tessellation. And what that does is it tells you, it kind of helps show that of the victims of the cholera outbreak, the Broad Street pump generally was the closest water source that they could have reached. So that thick black line that you see there is encompassing all the cases where the Broad Street pump was the closest water source. So again, it's really, although it's circumstantial, because nobody knows about the germ theory of disease as of yet. Although it's circumstantial, this is really compelling evidence. So despite John Snow producing this evidence, despite a monograph produced by Henry Whitehead, who was a local vicar who became convinced that the disease was waterborne, and also despite of a report by the vestry of the parish of St James also supporting the waterborne theory of John Snow, the health committee, the local health committee, they came up with this conclusion. So, despite all the evidence that John Snow had amassed, they said, we see no reason to adopt this belief. So the reason why this is clearly the first case of reviewer 2 in always reviewer 2, right? So the thing I like about this is, although you're told the story of John Snow as this triumph of the scientific method, which indeed it is, this also shows the kind of messy way imperfect way that science proceeds, because science is a messy, imperfect business because it's conducted by human beings, and we are messy and imperfect. So the reason why the health committee didn't go for this explanation is because they were proponents of the leading theory of the time, which was miasma theory, and the idea that disease was caused by bad smells. So they had set up their own set of data collection, which was geared to showing that smell caused disease. So it was a massive case of confirmation bias going on. But there was also, the other interesting thing was that they had evidence that kind of did support miasma, because there was a huge confound between poor air quality and poor water quality. So it's not too surprising that they kind of could find evidence to support their ideas. And also, there were also lovely Victorian ideas about the kind of terrible quality of the lower classes. So the minute they found a case that didn't fit their pattern, they could easily explain it by the inherent genetic quality of the individual who had either managed to survive or had succumbed to the disease if it happened in the wrong kind of place. So I think this is something that I want to emphasise, because that's what I want to kind of talk about today, is the way in which that science is a messy business, and sometimes it's difficult to get past the prevailing views, because as C.H. Waddington said in his book Tools for Thought, there is this thing, you said it's really difficult sometimes to get beyond the conventional wisdom of the dominant group. You're often fighting against it because there are these issues of power and influence that have an impact on science, no matter what we try to, no matter how we try to emphasise how the purity of science, it is a human activity and it will show these things. And Waddington gave this idea of the conventional wisdom of the dominant group. He said, he came up with a nifty acronym so we could all remember it very clearly, and he called it cow dung, which I think is rather lovely. So the point is that, as Charles Sanders Peirce, the famous pragmatist, said, we're not standing on a bedrock of fact. Science doesn't stand on a bedrock of fact. It walks on a bog. Okay, and it's only when the ground seems to be giving way that we are forced to move on. So we're forced to move on simply because the ideas we have are not working. And we'll stay with an idea as long as it seems to work, and then when it starts to give way, that's when we move. So we have to remember that this is what we're doing. We're not discovering the truth that's out there. We're coming at it by successive approximations. The models we have are all wrong, but some of them are useful. So that's the thing that we need to remember. Now, because I want to talk about some of those issues that I think are prevalent in certain areas of the human evolutionary sciences, I suppose it's good to say that I am no stranger to this process of being wrong myself. So I work on vervet monkeys in South Africa now for the past 8 years, and among other things, we're interested in looking at their responses to climate change. So we're doing a study of thermoregulation, where we look at their the ability of social strategies as well as physiognomic autonomic strategies to cope with shifts in temperature. So we're interested in, for example, to look at things like sunbasking and the way in which huddling, for example, can increase or decrease their ability to maintain a constant temperature, and the compromises that animals have to endure to do that, because in a social group, you can't always do what you want all the time. You have to compromise with other individuals. So this study throws up two things. It throws up interesting things that we really weren't expecting. So really just last week we found evidence of this phenomenon, which is known as gestational hypothermia. So what you've got here on the, well, it doesn't show. Okay, so on your left, on the bottom left, there is a non-pregnant female across the seasonal cycle. And then the three other graphs show you examples of pregnant females. And what you should note is that they have a lower body temperature during that low period of body temperature, which lies sort of below about 38 degrees, is the period of gestation. And that is sustained for the entire period of gestation, and then as soon as they give birth, you see it shoots back up again, almost instantly. Now that's something that's been seen in certain mammals, it's been seen in bats and rabbits, but it's not been seen very often, and there's some suggested evidence that it's found in humans. But there's only one study and that's not been replicated. But this is the first evidence that it occurs in a wild primate. And the idea is that the mother has to, by reducing her own body temperature, the fetus can dissipate heat into the mother's body. And in rabbits, this is associated with higher long-term reproductive success. So this is an interesting thing that we didn't expect to find, which plays into our interest in how in life history processes and reproductive success, and how thermoregulation and reproductive success are tied together. So that's a kind of nice way in which things can be, ideas can appear and new directions can be thrown up. And there are also these other things where, because we're interested in understanding how social strategies and life history and thermoregulation tie together, we're also looking at female social behaviour. Now, what's interesting about that is also quite annoying, which is that unlike the classic studies of vervet monkeys that were done by Dorothy Cheney and Robert Seyfarth, and there are also studies that were done more recently by Lynn Isbell at UC Davis, we don't see the same kinds of patterns. So, for example, what these graphs show you is how it shows you grooming in relation to dominance rank. So what you can see at the bottom graphs, which come from Amboseli in Kenya, the classic Cheney and Seyfarth study, is that animals tend to groom up the hierarchy. So the more high-ranking you are, the more grooming you receive. What you can see from the two groups at the top, which are from our study site in Samara in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, is we find absolutely bugger all. Right? There's nothing. They're not grooming up the hierarchy whatsoever. There's also no evidence that the female monkeys, groom closely ranked individuals more. So that's also a feature because closely ranked individuals are often likely to be kin. So what this again shows is that while the monkeys in the vervet monkeys in Amboseli, they all show a relationship where as the rank distance between two animals increases, the amount of time spent grooming decreases. So they're grooming animals that are adjacent in rank. You can see that the studies in the monkeys in our study site show either reverse, or again they show no relationship at all. So that's the kind of puzzling thing. They're not grooming up the hierarchy. They don't seem to be grooming putative kin, and they're not just behaving in an expedient manner either. So if you look at whether they, could it just be, well, they just groom the individuals that they just happen to be next to. And what this set of graphs shows you is, of our two study groups, is that the spatial rank of their associations, i.e. how much time, the proportion of time they spend in proximity to another individual, there's no relation to the amount of time they spend grooming that individual. That is just a shotgun scatter of points there. There's absolutely no relationship at all. So they're not just grooming in relation to the availability of partners, those who are available to them. So essentially, we have no idea what they're doing whatsoever. They're not doing anything that we expected. So it's not just like anarchy. It's not just chaos. They actually seem to show preferences, and there are these consistent preferences. We just can't explain them at the moment. So, that's a kind of interesting puzzle that we have made up various interpretations for, but we don't have any good answer. Now we also have a postdoc who's working with us, who's interested in male behaviour, and he's interested in how males achieve high rank. And he's been doing some analyses, and what he's found is that females are instrumental in helping males achieve high rank. And the reason why he found that is because he noticed that sometimes females will chase males and sometimes attack them. And he thought, well, maybe there's some systematicity to that. So maybe they help males achieve high-ranking success. So as this graph shows, he found evidence to support that. So what you've got here show you the data from our 3 study troops collapsed over all of them. So on the left, you've got grooming eigenvectors. So that's the degree to which a male is well connected to well connected females. Okay, so this is his measure of integration into the hierarchy. So as the male is more integrated, you can see his rank trajectory improves. So males, he has a faster rise in rank after he enters the troop. And the other graph shows you grooming degree, and what that shows is that the larger number of female partners a male has, again, the faster his rise up the ranks in the group. So females and males are achieving these social goals because it may well benefit a female to help particular males achieve high rank, because higher ranking males do have higher mating success. So maybe they are favouring certain males for particular reasons, perhaps due to MHC. We're investigating all these things at the moment. But the thing that's interesting is that when we were doing these analyses, we always put male and females ranked into our models separately. That we treated the male and female dominance hierarchies as independent. And the reason we did that is because vervet monkeys are Cercopithecines, and and males are about twice the size of females. So this normally means that all males outrank all females. And so this is the kind of pattern that we expected to see, that, the blue dots are the males, the green dots are the females. So you'd expect all males to rank above all females. And perhaps as you look over time, which is what we're trying to represent there in the different columns of dots, maybe, a very high-ranking female might defeat a very low-ranking male. But that would be a minor kind of blip in the dominance hierarchy. And generally you'd see this pattern. So we thought, oh, hang on, but maybe given that the females are having this effect, and given that females sometimes chase and interfere with males, maybe we should just have a look to make sure. Maybe we should construct some communal hierarchies. We should combine the male and female hierarchy together and just see what it looks like, just to be sure. And this is what we found. So what you can see there is that the male and female hierarchies are completely interdigitated. And in some instances, so this shows you, this is divided up into 6-month periods on the bottom there. And the reason we did that is because there are birth seasons and mating seasons, and we're trying to keep those separate and to see if there's an influence of those. So over these 6-month periods, what you can see is that particularly in the troop RST, females are often at the top of the entire hierarchy. They outrank all males. So what's interesting, when we found these results, we literally did this. So, in essence, we now have to start a lot of things all over again. And this probably explains why we can't explain what the females are doing, because we've left out half the entire story. We haven't been including males in our understanding of those things because we didn't think that they were necessarily relevant. We thought that males who were kind of, as Robin Dunbar said, that males would sort of be in the interstices between the female networks, but not really instrumental in the female networks. And that may be entirely wrong. So basically, the vervets weep for us, and we have got made it, so I know what it's like to be wrong. And so what I want to make, the reason why I want to suggest to you today is I want to make what is in fact like a truly modest proposal. I just want to say that in the evolutionary social sciences, there's often heavy criticism of the non-evolutionary social sciences, areas of anthropology, sociology, cultural studies, and there's also criticism of behaviorism as an approach to psychology. That these are dismissed as adhering to a blank slate view of the mind, and therefore they are inferior. And indeed, the non-evolutionary social sciences, they don't even often stick to the kinds of scientific methods that are the best way in order to discover interesting facts about the world. And so really we don't need to, they really need to get with the program, they really need to incorporate evolution, and that can bring everything together and it will all be hunky-dory. And what I want to suggest is perhaps that's not quite true, and perhaps we might be making an error. Sometimes we might have it wrong about certain approaches, and perhaps it's worth taking a moment and understanding what it is some of these other social sciences are doing, and trying to think about what behaviorism is and what it does, and whether these criticisms of blank slatism truly are justified. And I think that is just a very, very modest proposal. But I reference Jonathan Swift's satirical piece here, because if you say we should really maybe take notice of what anthropologists say, people often behave as though you've just said, let's eat a baby, right? So and I think people do believe that behaviourists actually do eat babies, okay? So here is Steven Pinker, for example, clutching his pearls and having a complete tiz about how behaviorism and Stalinism are more or less the same, and that Skinner is basically a Maoist, and that of course you can control behaviour if you have a gun, which just sounds very like Eddie Izzard to me, saying about how guns don't kill people, people kill people. And he's like, but I think the gun helps, don't you? Where he goes, you just pointed your fingers and went bang, that wouldn't do very much. So there's Pinker getting all his, getting the vapours. And here's Tooby and Cosmides. Also, similarly, now this one really stuns me because, where they say that we have all been complicit in the perpetuation of vast tides of human suffering, okay, by accepting a kind of, blank slate social science view, and that if only we'd come in quicker, we might have been able to stop all this terrible human suffering. And I have to say, when I read these things, I can feel my face forming this expression, right? I just so that's sort of, because the thing I think is interesting about that is the criticism of the non-evolutionary social sciences is often that they are just driven by ideology. And it should be very apparent to you that what I've just shown you are not scientific statements, they are ideological statements, they are polemics, they're designed to try and persuade us with rhetoric, not convince us with evidence. So, this standard social science model that is held up as a thing that we need to combat, that we need to replace with an evolutionary framework, because that will provide a better explanation of human evolution and behaviour, is I think it's I would like to suggest that it's actually something of a somewhat suspect straw man, and that what we need to do is look and see what are social scientists trying to do, because I'm pretty sure that no one has adhered to the kind of the extreme blank slate model that Pinker and Tooby and Cosmides present. Probably only John Locke subscribed to that. And so you're setting people up to make a distorted argument of their position, so that your argument seems more convincing as a consequence. And I should just note that this is the point where you put your disclaimer in, because when I say that, I don't mean to suggest that I don't agree with everything that goes on in the non-evolutionary social sciences. I'm not a postmodernist by any means, and I often find it very interesting when social anthropologists, for example, mention the F word, because I find what they do is they sort of say, they say you must never generalise about human beings. Human beings are too variable. You must, as Clifford Geertz says, you cannot generalise. It's very bad. There's no universal aspects of human behaviour. And then they spend the next 2 hours talking about power, right? Everything is power. And I was like, I'm just not getting something here, because that sounds very universal to me. So I'm not saying that we should just throw caution to the wind and accept everything that we hear. I'm just saying maybe we should reconsider certain ideas and think about them more broadly and look at what people are actually saying. And of course, I could be completely wrong in what I'm saying. I could be a big old smelly miasmatist myself, right? I could just be getting completely wrong. So the thing, just to sort of summarise the position of particularly evolutionary psychology, which I don't need to really do, but I just want to do it so we're all clear. Basically, that's the marriage of evolutionary theory, which I don't need to explain to anyone here, and cognitive psychology, and they adhere to a particular view of cognitive psychology, which is captured beautifully by the recent Pixar film Inside Out, which is just a Cartesian dream. It's lovely. And I just disagree fundamentally with this idea that of cognition as presented in this kind of way. And so would Pinker and Tooby and Cosmides. And so they adhere to the computational theory of mind, because they think it gets rid of these ideas to do with like homunculi and quite dodgy aspects of mentalism. It gets rid of that, and instead of having this kind of ghostly, immaterial, essence of mind that Descartes spoke about, we now have something more solid. We have information processing. So, as Pinker says here, the computational theory of mind is, one of the great ideas of intellectual history, because it solves the mind-body problem. Because our beliefs and desires, our mental states, are information incarnated as symbols, and those are processed and produce the kinds of motor outputs and our thoughts about the world and all these kinds of things that we have. And what this helps us do then is make sense of the evolution of mind. Without the computational theory of mind, he argues, we cannot do that. And so this theory of mind, this was obviously brought in following Chomsky's review of Skinner's book Verbal Behaviour, and Chomsky killed behaviourism dead with this review, so the legend goes, and the cognitive revolution took over, and this is now the way in which we understand the mind. And what Tooby and Cosmides did was say, okay, now this is great, now we can take these computational ideas and marry them to evolutionary theory, and in that way we will be able to work towards mapping out our universal human nature. And by that they mean the construction of, as it says here, higher resolution models of the evolved mechanisms that collectively constitute universal human nature. So that's what our human nature is. It's this set of functional specializations, psychological mechanisms that addressed the recurrent problems that we encountered during the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. So given that seems all very reasonable to some degree, why do I have sympathy with certain anthropologists and with behaviourists in particular? And I think that's best epitomised and explained by this anthropologist here, who is Tim Ingold, who is a very famous social anthropologist. And I find it, and this might say, those of you who know Tim Ingold and know his work might find this a very odd choice, because Tim starts his most recent book, there's a chapter in it, the beginning chapter, the opening chapter, where he starts it literally with this sentence, right? Neo-Darwinism is dead. And then goes on to sort of berate all of us evolutionary types for not quite realising that this is the case. And so we're just basically, trying to prop up the corpse of neo-Darwinism, like in a Victorian photograph, and hope for the best. And we're just really on a hiding to nothing because it's never going to work. Now that immediately you're just thinking, what? What does he mean? What is he talking about? Evolutionary theory explains so many things. We have so much success. We have such a great body of work and knowledge now that is based on the application of evolutionary theory to animal life, including humans. So why is he doing this? Is he really one of these, nutty postmodern, people who doesn't believe that there's a real world out there and all that kind of stuff? And if you read other things that Tim Ingold is writing, if you pay attention to what he's saying, what you realise is that he's not opposed to evolutionary theory at all. In fact, he wrote the first book I ever read by Tim Ingold was called Evolution and Social Life, which suggests that he doesn't really have a major problem with evolution itself. And he doesn't really have a problem with neo-Darwinism if you take the classical definition of neo-Darwinism. What he has a problem with is the modern synthesis, which was the marriage of Mendelian transmission genetics with population genetics. And the reason why he objects to that is because he thinks it substitutes a theory of form for a theory of genes. And he's not alone in that. There are many other people who agree with that. So Massimo Pigliucci, for example, who is both a biologist and a philosopher, has written a lot on this, and he talks about the need for an extended evolutionary synthesis. And there are other people like Kevin Leyland and Kim Sterelny who have also talked about this. And basically what they mean by that is that the original question that Darwin posed, which is, why are there so many different kinds of life, and how did they get like that, and how do they stay like that, has been replaced by the definition that came with the modern synthesis, where evolution is defined as a change in gene frequencies over time. And he says that's why it seems so reductionist. That's why I object to the modern synthesis. That's why I object to the way evolutionary theory is often used, because it's using the definition of evolution as a shift in gene frequencies. So you can't tell, and this is what many of my social anthropologist friends that I have at my university say, is that you can't tell me it's not reductionist when the very definition of evolution is a change in gene frequencies. And I kind of want to go, oh, no, it's, but then you're kind of a bit stuck, because you kind of go, oh, hang on, it is, isn't it? It's about genes. And I think that's because, the point that Ingold is making is the thing that's missing is development. And we've known that for a long time, that we know that 95% of all, genetics is developmental genetics. Transmission genetics makes up a small proportion of that. But it's very difficult. And we have Evo, Devo now and all these kinds of things. But what Ingold is trying to get at is this idea that if you think of things in terms of forms, and you can think about them as in terms of biology, and you don't have to think about genes in a way that is going to interfere with your ability to think about how humans should be viewed in an evolutionary perspective. So to illustrate what he means by that, he says, and this is one you have to this is, if you were here last year, this is one of my favourite topics, which is how babies learn to walk. And so Ingold says, well, let's consider walking. Now, this is something where we say, yes, all humans, all typically developing humans learn to walk. But you don't just get up, you're not just born and then like immediately toddling off down the shops or anything like that. You have to learn to walk. And even royal babies have to learn to walk. And it takes time, and you have to be scaffolded, and eventually you are able to do it. It's a learned, embodied skill. And so you can think of, so we understand that it is biological, but it's also something that is learned. It combines both of those things in a very deep way. And there isn't just one way of walking. It's remarkable how much variation there is in styles and gaits of walking across human cultures. So that's another thing. And the speed with which babies learn to walk. So you can use, Karen Adolphs has done really nice studies showing that whether you wear a cloth nappy or a Pampers disposable nappy can influence the speed at which kids learn to walk. So those kind of influences are important too. Now, so walking is a biological, learned, embodied skill. And what Ingalls says is, well, so is cello playing. And this is where, the internet is wonderful, because you ask the internet and it will just provide. I went to Google Images and typed in baby playing a cello, and here it gave me one. So what Ingalls says is, well, when I learned to play the cello, it wasn't sort of transmitted to me. I grew into it. I developed the skill of playing the cello in much the same way that babies develop and learn the skill of walking. I was shaped, I was scaffolded. My teacher bent my fingers around the top bit of the cello, whatever that's called. And then the bow. Yeah, I remember. Very musical. And so he says, if you look at it like that, if you think of it like that, then instead of what he's trying to do, what Ingalls is trying to do is dissolve the dichotomy between nature and culture that continually arises and continually frustrates us all. Because he wants to say, well, if you think of these things as biological skills that come about as a consequence of learning them in a particular kind of developmental niche, which for us humans includes both walking and cello playing, then you can say that we have these are all biological skills. But what you wouldn't want to say is that there are any sort of genes for cello playing. We know that seems very ridiculous, right? And we know that that's a kind of shorthand, and we can qualify that in all kinds of ways. But we're much happier talking about genes that are sort of associated with walking. And he says that's kind of the problem with having this genetic basis for things. Whereas if you just think about it as developmental and biological, you can get rid of that. And you can think about these things as equally biological. And therefore you dissolve the nature-culture divide. And I think that's a pretty, nice argument. I'm kind of becoming increasingly convinced by this kind of biosocial approach. And I think that it's something that evolutionary psychologists have not yet quite managed to deal with, because there's still, even though people like Clark Barrett and William Frankenhace are bringing in development into the ideas of evolutionary psychology, they're really striving to bring developmental systems theory in. There still retains this separation between nature and culture. So, as John Classiel says in this paper that just recently came out, so this is the evolutionary. I can't remember what the EHPN stands for now, obviously, and my mind's going to complete blank, but it's something like I might have the P and the H around the wrong way as well. It's the evolutionary psychology view of human nature. That's it. It should be EPHN. So if you have that, this view that he's suggesting, which combines Clark Barrett's views and combines several other philosophers' views, then we will be able to peel away all the history and culture and ecological things that feed into the parameters of our adaptations, and then we'll be able to see, the invariant aspects. We'll be able to get at the core of human nature. And people like Ingalls, and this is what I think people like Clifford Geertz are saying when they're saying there's no such thing as an ahistorical human. That's what they're getting at. They're trying to say there is no core. Because if you're thinking about that, you're making the separation between the kind of biological genetic bits and the cultural bits. And they're trying to get rid of that dichotomy. And that's something that I have been, like I said, I've been increasingly convinced by that, because this is why I first got interested in height. So when I was first introduced to G at this conference in 2012, Craig Roberts introduced me and said, this is Curtin, who works on, he's doing his PhD on height. And I was like, what? Like, a whole PhD on height? Like, what's he do? How much is there to do? It's like you just grow tall or you just grow short, don't you? Just grow. And in fact, he gave a talk, and I suddenly realised that, in fact, you can't look at height like that. Height is actually fascinating because it brings in, you can't understand it without understanding absolutely, you have to bring in everything. You have to bring in development, and you have to bring in things like political and socio-economic status. You have to understand something about the way the economic systems of a particular country work. You have to understand that when you talk in life history terms, that some people are, that it makes evolutionary sense that this is a short population. It reduces maintenance costs. It influences. It produces a faster onset of reproduction. That maybe has humanitarian implications, because if people think, well, there's a whole thing of this small is beautiful idea, where particular chap argued that you shouldn't need to, if you've got a particular short population, if they're designed to be short, so to think, you don't need to supplement people's diets, because there's no point, because they're the right size for their habitat. Now, that may be true evolutionarily, but is that something that we want to consider in that way, in a humanitarian sense? So you can't get away from all these political and social and other factors when you study something like height. It's not simply a biological phenomenon, it's truly a biosocial phenomenon. And so I think that's why I'm sympathetic to people like social anthropologists like Ingold, because I don't think they're the enemy. I think they're trying to emphasise these kinds of approaches, that we have to understand things biosocially, and I think there's a genuine effort there to really work at getting rid of the nature-culture dichotomy once and for all. Now, the other bugbear of Tooby and Cosmides that they point to is Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist. And the reason why they dislike him is because they think he's just thrown the scientific method out the window altogether, and he just wants to talk about, he wants to analyse cultures as texts. Okay, so he thought we should interpret cultures. So famously, Geertz said that with Weber, he thought that man was an animal suspended in webs of significance that he himself has spun, and he took culture to be those webs, and therefore the job of the anthropologist was to be interpret those. So it wasn't to be an experimental science where you discovered all these laws. It was to be an interpretive exercise in the search of meaning. How do people make meaning in their lives? How do they construct meaning? How do they understand what it is that they're doing? And that was not just, it wasn't sort of a matter of finding out, well, what are they really doing? It was saying, no, what are people saying they're doing, and what do they think they're doing, and what does it mean to them when they do particular things? And the chosen method that he advocated for that was Gilbert Ryle's method of thick description. And here again, this is my other gift from the internet. So this perfectly sums up the notion of thick description. So what Ryle said when he wrote about it, he used the example of a wink. So he said, when you wink, that's just not just some kind of twitching of your eyelid. You can't describe a wink as, oh, it's when your eyelid goes up and down, rapidly in the space of, 1 second or less. That doesn't tell you what a wink is. A wink is something that you have to interpret, and it can have several layers of meaning. So you wink at someone, they understand what it is you're doing, they understand what you're signalling. There's shared meaning there. You could be very bad at winking and do it very poorly, and someone else could notice that, and they could then copy the way you wink and to their own friends in a way as a way to mock you. And so although ostensibly that wink would look the same, it would be a very different kind of wink. So in this way you can get these layers of description that come to tell you what it is that something means. And so this is a really nice, this picture here is another really nice way of adding to that layer, because now in order to understand the meaning of this, you have to get the whole Ryan Gosling feminist meme thing, right? So there's another layer here that if you understand that, we share a meaning with people who don't understand that meme. Okay, so this is what he's getting at. So this kind of interpretative way of looking at things, this kind of working out how people bring meaning to their lives does not seem to me to be a pointless endeavour. It seems to me quite an important one. And I have personally got a lot of, out of reading these kinds of ethnographic accounts. So they're called ethnographic sociology, which seems to be purely because they're based in a Western society rather than a non-Western society. But all of these books are fascinating, and in particular, The Managed Heart and Promises I Can Keep has been very, very instrumental in telling me things that I have needed to know in recent work that I've been doing with her on wealth and fertility, for example, and decision and reproductive decision making in modern Western industrial society. So this striving for meaning and understanding how people make meaning in their lives seems to me a useful adjunct to what it is that we do when we're trying to analyse the outcomes of people's decisions. Because I don't think it's simply a matter of taking things. I don't think this is simply a matter of taking what people say at face value, but there is value to understanding what they think it is that they're doing, and that's what Geertz himself did when he looked at how political change in Indonesia, how that changed how people saw themselves and how they got me, and that was the subject of his original ethnographies. So it's not just anthropologists who feel like this. So this is Jerry Brunner, who's a very famous psychologist. And in 1990, he produced this book, Acts of Meaning, which is really just is a transcript of a series of lectures he gave. And this is a lovely book, really good read, and I can highly recommend it. And what Brunner says is that he was one of the architects, or so he thought, of the original cognitive revolution that was designed to oust behaviourism and bring mentality back into psychology. And as he says here, what he thought they were doing, what he and his friends thought they were doing, they thought they were, it was an all-out effort to establish meaning as a central concept in psychology. And then in the book, he goes on to show how, very quickly, meaning became information in the computer sort of paradigm. And the construction of meaning turned into information processing. And in that, he says, we lost what he was interested in psychology, because he said, information is irrelevant, is sort of, meaning is irrelevant to information. If you use Shannon information, meaning doesn't play any kind of role. And these kinds of information processing algorithms are often purely syntactic, and meaning can't get in. And he says, I think then we've lost the subject matter of psychology. So it's not just anthropologists, interpretive anthropologists, who are seeking after a different understanding of human psychology. There are psychologists who also feel this way too. And Brunner came up with this idea that narrative and narrative practice was a way in which we come to understand others around us, and he wrote several books on this. And this is where I also point to where philosophy is a very useful avenue as well. So this is Dan Hutto, who's a philosopher, and he has written several and edited several books that deal with folk psychological narratives, as he calls them. And what he suggests is that we don't have to, the whole aim of the computational theory of mind and sort of various kinds of people interested in neurophilosophy, like the Churchlands, Paul and Patricia Churchland, is that they kind of want to eliminate folk psychology and then get, so when we talk about folk psychology, what we really mean is like, the firing of certain, neurons in our brain, and that we can reduce things down to the brain level. And Hutto says, no, there's a reason why folk psychology is useful. What is folk psychology used for? And this is what he feels is the subject matter of psychology. We use folk psychology in a normative way. We use it to practice giving and receiving reasons for our actions. And we use that so that people understand conduct in the particular society in which they live. So his idea is that through narrative, folk storytelling, fairy storytelling practices, we come to understand other minds and why people act for the reasons they do, and it's all done in terms of folk psychology. So he's not trying to reduce it, he's carrying on Brunner's project. which I think is very interesting, because it reminds me of certain work that is done in cultural evolution, for example. So I think this is where you could tie in very nicely with people like Jamie Tarani and his work on, the Little Red Riding Hood story and how that changes through time, and how the origins of particular folk tales. Are those tales things that also seem to, the elements that persist, or are those the things that seem to also have this normative aspect? Are they things that are kind of helping tell us how it is that we can give and receive reasons for our actions? So the whole idea here is to not try to just reduce everything to the unconscious algorithms that generate our behaviour. Is to try and understand why people talk in the ways they do when they talk about the things they do, and to take that analysis at face value. Now, that may not require an evolutionary approach, it may not be necessary, but I do think it's an interesting addition to the kinds of things that are being done in the evolutionary social sciences. And the interesting thing is that Brunner, said, well, this is I want to replace behaviourism. I don't just want to amend it or, improve it. We wanted to replace it out and out because it wasn't getting us what we wanted. And the irony is that in a radical behaviourist viewpoint, you could do exactly what Brunner wanted to do. So that's the interesting final thing that I want to talk about, is the way in which radical behaviourism really isn't what most of us think it is. So again, here's Pinker, where he says, the phone rings and someone answers it and they chat to their friend and then they go out somewhere and do some stuff. And he said, how might we explain why Rex just walked over to the phone? We would not say that phone-shaped stimuli caused Rex's limbs to move in a certain arcs. Okay, so that is the worst caricature of radical behaviourist views that I think I've ever seen. The only one worse than that is Chomsky's review of Skinner's book, right, which is possibly the worst piece of scholarship ever said to be true. I don't think he even read it. Honestly, it's really terrible. It talks about pigeons and all these things, and there's not a mention of pigeons in verbal behaviour. So the point is, we would not say that phone-shaped stimuli do this, and nor would a radical behaviourist. Radical behaviourism is simply not about simple stimuli response reflex arcs. That's Watson's behaviourism. And Skinner was very clear about this. What Skinner's project was to find the functional relations between classes of stimuli and classes of responses. Because he defined operants. I mean, operants are precisely those things that cannot be produced by an eliciting stimulus. Operants are acts that animals or organisms take in the world that have certain consequences, and they are those consequences, and that either increases the frequency with which those behaviours are produced next time or reduces it, and it's probabilistic. So what he's trying to establish are the functional relations between particular classes of stimuli and particular consequences, and the stimuli can vary in particular ways and the responses can vary in particular ways, but if they achieve the same functional outcome, then they get classed in they're the same operant. So there's nothing reflex-like about any of that. And the other thing that Skinner was, he was essentially a pragmatist. He didn't want to accept any distinction between inner and outer worlds. That you should be able to, that whatever's happening inside us, which he firmly believed there were things happening inside us, whatever's happening inside us must follow the same laws as the stuff that happens outside us. And what's happening inside us is really just more behaviour that we can study in similar kinds of ways. And the other thing is that that Pinker gets wrong about Skinner is that he simply was not a rank slatist of any kind. So as Skinner himself said, and Skinner blamed this on Watson. So this is Skinner complaining about Watson, and he says, it's Watson's problem here, because no reputable student of animal behaviour has ever taken the position that the animal comes in as a tabula rasa, that species differences don't matter, that all responses are equally conditionable for all stimuli. And Skinner, in other writings, he goes on to explain how the animal you choose to study determines the design of the Skinner box. It designs how you should set up your Skinner box, what kind of manipulandum you should use, how you should arrange things for the animal, because the animal itself matters. So what radical behaviorism is getting at is the way it works is to say, okay, the reason why you get these functional relations between stimuli and responses is due to the history of interactions with the environment that an organism has, both ontogenetically, i.e. the ones that it kind of learns in its lifetime, and importantly, phylogenetically. And, you know, I said on the last slide that it was, you know, the functional relations are produced through selection by consequences. And this was an explicit analogy to Darwinian natural selection. So you produce a variety of behaviours, and the ones that work for you those are the ones that are reinforced, and those are the ones you produce more of, and the ones that aren't, you produce less of. And the interesting thing here is that what Skinner is trying to do here is he's trying to get at more or less what evolutionary psychologists are trying to get at. He's trying to say, why is behaviour produced now? What happened in the past to make the animal behave in that way now? And he just all he does is leave out the bit in the middle. Okay, he just leaves out the bit that's to do with cognition. So interestingly enough, Pinker, however, when he says this is the correct explanation that we might give, we might say that he wanted to speak to his friend Cecile and knew that Cecile was home, right? That's the kind of causal, meaningful, interpretive explanation that people like Brunner and Hutto and Geertz are talking about. And so so this is just, you know, basic folk psychology that Pinker is talking about here, and it doesn't have any more explanatory power. It's a description of what people do. It doesn't get at the machinery of what they've done at all. It's not a truly cognitive explanation. We don't know the algorithm. That's just a folk psychological reason for action. So what Skinner was objecting to was really and he was objecting to cognitivism. He was objecting to the idea that there was something in the middle between the input and the output that did all the work. His idea was that that you could understand what the insides were doing as well as the outsides were doing through the same process. So whatever had changed inside the animal to produce that outside behaviour or be part of the outside behaviour came about because of the history of interactions with the environment, and that was done in and these were produced evolutionarily as well as ontogenetically. So and this idea that our brains are computers and that the brain does all the heavy lifting of cognition is so prevalent. And this is from Gary Marcus last year in the New York Times, where he just sort of unequivocally says, look, face it, your brain is a computer. And if you have any objections to this, like brains are cereal and they can't produce emotions, that's just wrong. You're just being daft. It really is a biological computer. We just have to find out what kind of computer it is. And the objections he's raising are really as though when Shakespeare was saying, you know, and Juliet is the sun, he didn't mean she was his, you know, the centre of his life and the force he couldn't live without or anything like that. He kind of, you know, as though Shakespeare was saying, and Juliet is a giant ball of gas. Because what people like Skinner object to is basically this, that, and this is the single best depiction of the representational theory of mind that I've ever seen. So this was from BuzzFeed, which is where I get all my information. And it was something like, you know, like all these kids who were going places. So this is from an actual kids thing. And there you go at the bottom. How do you know? Show your thinking. And there he is, representing Bobby in his head. And so what Skinner was saying was that when you have this kind of view, when you say Bobby is the cause of the writing of Bobby on the paper, that's just an intermediate cause. It's not the ultimate cause. What ultimately does it is what's happened in your previous history of interactions with the environment. So in order to really explain the behaviour, we have to go back to the history of interactions. The whatever's going on inside you is part and parcel of the behaviour to be explained. So as he says here, no adequate science of behaviour must consider events that take place within the skin of the organism. They're not physiological mediators of behaviour, they're part of behaviour itself. So his idea of behaviourism was that we should understand the history of interactions with the environment that produce particular kinds of behaviours, and in doing that we would come to understand the kinds of things that physiologists would need to study, and then they'd be able to tell us what it was that was going on internally in the organism. He didn't deny that those things happen. He didn't deny private events. They are real, and they can be studied. If you can talk about something, you can study it in a radical behaviour analysis. So you could entirely look at the folk psychological reasons that people give for their actions and study those in a radical behaviourist framework by looking at the history of interactions that led people to produce certain responses in certain situations. You could entirely do that. And Skinner's entire point was that the skin is not that important a boundary, and this is Anthony Gormley's Quantum Cloud, which is beautiful sculpture. So it's got this, you can see this human figure in it, sort of surrounded by all these other things. And I think this sort of captures something of what Skinner is trying to get at. You know, we're just he kind of said we're just a locus for certain things. It's not that things are inside us. We're changed by the events that happen, but to kind of locate them purely inside us and give that unwarranted causal powers is to really not provide the ultimate explanation that we need. That lies in our history. That lies in our history of interactions with the environment, which includes our evolutionary history. And that is precisely what evolutionary psychologists are trying to do. They are behaviourists. It's like the way dinosaurs still walk among us as birds. You know, they really are behaviourists to some degree. They're just mixing up, they're kind of mixing up their behaviourism with this kind of with cognitivism and coming up with this amalgam where they think they've explained what's going on by pointing to a hypothetical entity that is a cognitive mechanism. And Skinner would say, you haven't done your work yet, you stopped too soon. And I think that's true. I think that is a valid criticism, and I think that is what happens in cognitive psychology. So that's what I've got to say to you. I really do think that we need to take these kinds of views more seriously and give them more credence. If nothing else, it just gives you something else to think about. And I do think that when we do this and you take on board these ideas that come from people like Brunner and Geertz, and you take on some of what Skinner says and how we can learn about the world, I think then the case that Geertz makes, that looking for universals is not necessarily the thing to do, and that instead it's in the cultural particularities of people, in their oddities, that we might understand what it means to be most generically human, might be found. Because I think what is perhaps universal about humans is simply just this constant openness to change that we have. We are, the constancy is a paradox. The constancy is the fact that we're always changing. And I think, this kind of image, it just sums it up for me. So this is another of one of these lovely Victorian things. So this is a woman, this is two babies having their portrait done, and their mother is sitting under that curtain. So she doesn't really appear in the photo. But now we all know she's there. So this, to me, that seems there's something generically human, but idiosyncratically human about that. And I think if we, understanding ourselves is such a complex thing that we should be using all the tools we have at our disposal to try and get a handle on that, and not dismissing certain ones out of hand just because they don't suit our particular point of view, and we want to push for that and make that seem so much more right by making everything else seem wrong. We don't have to clear a space like that. We can have a positive project where we present the views we have without having to denigrate others in order that ours fit more perfectly. There's space for us all. So that's all I have to say to you, and thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Question?
Yes.
Okay. Is that on?
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. It was really interesting. And I have a sort of a comment and a question. The comment is that I put in a bit of cultural anthropology qualitative work to a grant application a couple of years ago, basically to find an excuse to put someone on the grant. But since then, what I've actually had is a cultural anthropologist in the field collecting what was meant to be standard quantitative psychological data for me, and it has been absolutely eye-opening, actually, how fusing his cultural anthropology training and more experimental psychology approaches has really produced some really interesting results. And I think that sort of ties into this quite
Excellent.
well.
My work is done.
The question I had, it's more that I noticed, the quotes you're pulling up from Pinker and Tutti Cosmides. I noticed this when I'm trying to write lectures using quotes from them on these sorts of issues, is that they're all at least 10 years old. And I would love to see you give this talk at EHBEA. I'm really sad I can't be there to see how it would play out there. Do you think that's still what they think now?
Yeah, so I realised that myself as I was doing it, right? Because you use them in it. But there's a paper from 2013. I mean, I think actually I think that one of those ones is from something is much more recent. That Vast Tides of Suffering. I think I might have even had the date on there. I think that is something like from 2000, from an annual review of psychology from 2013. Oh, the updated David Buss handbook that was originally come out. That's just come out. A new edition of that's come out, and they say the same thing in there still. They haven't updated it. They've updated certain things, added in more empirical stuff, but those kinds of basic statements like that are still the same as they were from 10 years ago whenever that first came out. So I do think that and I mean, I don't know if you read the Edge website. To John Tooby last year, it was like, what idea must die? And John Tooby said, learning and culture. And it was like, what? So yeah, I mean, as always with John Tooby, it was rather opaque. In writing, it was quite dense. But I sort of got the gist, which was mainly that, they just must go. They don't explain anything. And I think, I mean, in a sense, that's what someone like Tim Ingold would say. If you say, why is people's behaviour so variable? Why are cultures so variable? And then you say culture, it's just circular. So I kind of get that criticism, but I think he was going further than that, saying it was the same kind of thing of you've got to do science. You can't do these kinds of social science things because we'll never understand what humans are like if we do that. But that's a fair point.
Oh, hi.
Hello.
Is it working?
Yeah.
I'm an evolutionary psychologist, and I agree with some of the ideas you put forward, and it's great that you linked evolutionary thinking to other diverse areas of psychology. One that you may have missed is kind of humanistic psychology, which has been developed. Some of what you said about Bruner's work are ideas looking for meaning that have been much more sought within humanistic work. I, in my work, try and link humanistic work and evolutionary psychology in training psychotherapists. My question is, do you gain any heart from looking at some of the co-evolution, gene culture, co-evolutionary ideas that are coming up? To me, they seem to sort of help to link many areas of psychology better with evolutionary theory.
I do. I mean, I just read Joe Henrich's book, and that's very good. But I mean, there's still a bit of this tension between, because he sort of says, we need to have, at some point he says, we need to have these kinds of rules because our natural pair bonding instincts are very weak, or something like, like he kind of there's still this tension between some things being, quite biological, and then culture comes on top of that, and not kind of being culturally biological in a thoroughgoing way. Although but there's a very positive thing where he talks about how we use abacuses, and he sort of talks about them as mental prosthetics, and I would agree with that, but I would go even further and say they're not just prosthetics, they're actually part of our cognitive system. They are, that again, using an abacus is biological in the way that Ingold says. Yeah, and meaningful, yes. So, and I mean, there's all sort of nice work that comes out of, like Malafouris has done this nice thing of how things shape the way we think, and looking at systems of counting and how we understand meaning in that way. So yes, I do take heart from some of those things, but I do think sometimes they end up being, this is the culture bit and this is the biology bit, which maybe can't be avoided. Maybe that's just an analytical strategy. Maybe this is a pragmatic strategy to make things tractable. You hold the biology constant, look how culture changes things. You hold the culture constant, you look how, then you see how they interact. Maybe you have to do that in a that kind of mathematical approach, because otherwise the maths gets too difficult. I mean, that's true of many fields. So it would be wrong to single them out for dealing with a tractable problem rather than with the more complex aspect of that problem. But basically I have optimism in all things. So.
Okay. Yeah. I think it's my turn. Oh. Okay, great. Yeah, I'm here. I really
the voice
like
of God coming at me.
You didn't talk about that yet. No, I really liked your talk. I always have felt very uncomfortable with the whole idea of the standard social science model, which I never recognized, because I think we're talking at least about 3 or 4 very different types of branches of sciences, some of which you touched.
Sure.
Behaviorism is something very different from social constructionism. It's actually the complete opposite, and it's very different from a lot of, say, the anti-biological cultural anthropology, and I can mention any more topics. So I think it's very good that you point to that. I think that the issue is, for example, and I'm happy that you bring in operant and classical condition, special operant condition, because into this society again, because I think evolutionary psychology is not at all incompatible with the whole idea of operant condition. In the opposite, a lot of the things we study, especially, for example, male sexual behavior, is very, very subject to operant conditioning. But one thing I just want to comment is that Steve Pinker, I think his ideas are extreme and are not correct, so I completely agree with you, but Skinner's ideas about language acquisition, that was what he was attacking, and assuming that is a process that goes through operant conditioning was really a completely wrong idea. And so I think we have to make a distinction of in which areas of behavior operant conditioning is functioning, for example, and in which areas it's not at all functioning, and other processes of learning take place. And learning is, of course, it's absurd to think that learning is as part of evolutionary psychology as anything. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. But I would say that's what Chomsky was criticising, it's what Pinker's criticised, but there's a reason that book is called Verbal Behaviour and not Language. And that, so do you know what I mean? So I do think they kind of also, that Skinner really was talking about verbal behaviour as behaviour and not about the kinds of things that Chomsky is talking about.
Is it on? Yeah, thank you very much for that lovely talk. How does what you say map onto the distinction that Kenneth Pike made between emic and etic descriptions of a culture? Emic descriptions being in the culture's own terms, etic descriptions being in the terms of the scientist, if you like. And most of science, of course, is etic because atoms don't have their own terms, or ants don't. How does it map onto that?
So, I mean, that's a very nice and interesting question, John, because that's sort of the things that Geertz was struggling with, right? So he's got those ethnographies that are sort of straightforward ethnographies, and then he's got, the interpretation of cultures and local knowledge, where that's what he's trying to struggle with. And I suppose as a cop-out, I'll give you the kind of answer that he gave, which I think is to say, the thing that's interesting to me, and it's what people like John Dewey have said, and it's people like Ian Hacking say, there's a guy called Sven Brinkman, and they sort of make this idea of like psychology being an inherently moral science, because you can't leave yourself out of it. There's psychology, the discipline, and then psychology, the thing we all do, and you can't distinguish. You have to recognise your own role in that subject matter. So Ian Hacking would say, for example, if you I'm going to pinch an example from G. If you shout at a chicken, you're terrible at mathematics. The chicken doesn't care, right? If you shout at a small girl, you're terrible at mathematics. That might influence the way in which she sees herself and what she thinks she can and can't do. So there's that reflexivity to human responding that has to come in. So I think what Geertz was saying, that maybe you can't get the emic perspective as the anthropologist, but you can make sure that you're making clear that this is your interpretation, so you can be present in the analysis, so to speak. So I don't. No, but I mean, he says somewhere that you know, he kind of goes, oh, I'm just, you know, he does that kind of schlubby, cute thing where he goes, oh, I'm just like a middle-aged white dude who goes to places and chats to people, and this is what they tell me, and you know, so he kind of says those things about how he sort of is there, and he can't, you know, rely on the fact that they're what they're telling him is how they themselves see it. So he's just saying that's what he's saying is like, how they see themselves is what you're trying to get at, but it's really your interpretation of their interpretations. I'll talk to you afterwards. Oh, good. Well, I'll see you afterwards then.
More questions? Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk.
Yeah.
Open conditioning didn't work for me. Thank you. I worry that some people who don't know any better might leave the room thinking that there are to-be cosmetics and Pinker on the one hand and behaviorists and anthropologists on the other hand. Now, of course, there's always been, since the cognitive science movement started, a big tradition of cognitive anthropology, ever since Jacobson and Lévi-Strauss rebelled against behaviorism. Chomsky wasn't the only one, and there is a movement of cognitive semiotics, of cognitive pragmatics, and everyone agrees that meaning is not reducible to Shannon's information. Meaning is information plus intention. It has to be interpreted, can't be just computed. So I had the feeling that you wanted to brush aside this whole tradition, but perhaps you can correct me.
Well, no, I wanted to brush it aside. No.
But let's do it anyway.
No. I would say that the reason why there's Tubin, Cosmides and Pinker on the one side is because they did that, right? They don't take on Lévi-Strauss in their analyses. They only take on Geertz, right? When you read those things, they're not. And you could say that Lévi-Strauss was an evolutionary, psychologist, right? He was he agreed that there was this in his structuralist view, that there was a common core that, so they don't take his idea. They didn't take the best of what was out there and try and improve on it. They just picked on what they felt was the worst. I mean, that's what Richard Alexander said about Marshall Salins, that's what, when he criticised the other way, that's what people were doing. So I had a limited amount of time, so I couldn't get everything in. And so, there are other people can speak to that. But yes, there are, and also I think that does reflect something of my own position, which is to say, I think some of the cognitive anthropology sort of still sticks to. So Dan Sperber is a kind of modular theorist and has been all along, and so his particular kind of cognitive anthropology sort of does touch on the ideas that I am less in agreement with, which go towards the sort of embodied inactive Andy Clark, Richard Minari view of cognition, that they're not trying to, they're trying to get away from the idea of a representational mind. So people like Dan Hutto and Eric Meehan particularly are trying to get away from a representational theory of mind and truly treat scaffolded linguistic minds as something that we have and that are built onto these basic non-representational minds and integrated with them. So they're trying to come up with a whole different theory of cognition completely. So I'm more in tune with that, and some of the cognitive anthropology is too cognitivist for me. So maybe the reason I haven't spoken about it is because it's not that I brush it aside, but to me that's a whole different set of arguments that you have to have about different things, which is what is the nature of cognition, in general, and how do you study it. So I don't know if that's a cop-out, but it's sort of, I'm not trying to brush it aside. And I just think there are other people better qualified to sort of speak to that as well, so at this very conference. Like you, for example.
Let's thank Louise. No, that's right. That's right. We'll just do it once. Step. Yeah. Please wait. There's something.
Sorry, I made an error.
Please,
That's my fault.
please. It's Louise's fault, but please do stay for a little bit longer.
There we
There
go.
you're. There we. There you go.
Thank you very much again to Louise for setting off our conference in style, I think encapsulating EB's ethos there. So I can see you're all raring to go to drink wine, and I am going to release you to the wine reception in just a moment. But before I do need to thank the sponsors who have generously funded that wine reception. So the Galton Institute are paying for your wine this evening. The Galton Institute is an association interested in human heredity, in genetics. They stemmed from an association that was funded initially by Francis Galton's legacy. They have been very generous funders, in fact.